The scream came first sharp, cracking through the still morning like something breaking inside a human soul. Two teenage boys tore through the trees, their breathing ragged, their voices collapsing into each other as they tried to make sense of the horror lying just a few feet ahead. One stumbled back. The other froze. Neither of them would ever forget what they saw. There she was, Mimi Wallace, 19 years old, a girl who once laughed loudly, studied hard, and planned big, now reduced to a still, cold silence that no one deserved. Her body lay twisted as if the world had fought her and won, her clothes marked with struggle, her face turned away, as if she were trying to hide from the very moment that ended her life. The boys didn't speak. They couldn't. The truth sat in their throats like a stone too heavy to swallow. One covered his mouth, the other kept whispering, "No, no, no," as if denying it could rewrite the morning. The question hit like a punch to the chest. How did a quiet college girl end up here? And why did it take 49 years for her truth to finally break free? This wasn't just another tragedy tucked into a forgotten file. This was a wound that refused to stay buried. Stay with us, this cold case changes everything. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, we'd love to know. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, hit like, subscribe, switch on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would appreciate it too. Hours before her life was stolen, Mimi was standing behind the counter of the Blue Plate Special, wiping down tables after a long shift. Her smile that night wasn't forced. It wasn't tired. It had that warm spark she carried everywhere, the one her friends always said made even the dullest nights feel lighter. She clocked out at a little after 11 p.m., sliding her little clutch purse under her arm like she'd done countless times before. Brenda, her closest friend at work, leaned on the doorframe, teasing her one last time. "Don't stay up reading those thick books again. You'll oversleep, Mimi." Mimi laughed. A soft, genuine laugh that filled the empty diner with life. If Brenda had known that sound would be the last one she'd ever hear from her, she would have held on to it, memorized it, begged it not to end. Mimi stepped out into the cold Wisconsin night, her breath curling into the air as she pulled her coat tighter. Streetlights stretched weak beams across the road, just enough for her to see the familiar path home. She wasn't scared. She wasn't nervous. She'd walked that route so often it felt like part of her routine. A few blocks. A few minutes. That was all it should have taken. Brenda watched her go. The door slowly swinging shut behind her. Something tugged at her chest, a strange heaviness she still regrets ignoring. If she could go back, she would have walked with her. She would have insisted. She would have done anything except what she actually did. Let her friend disappear into the night alone. Because that was the last moment anyone ever saw Mimi alive. Mimi walked with steady steps, her boots crunching softly along the familiar sidewalk. The night wasn't loud, just the distant hum of passing cars and the whisper of cold wind weaving through empty streets. For someone else, that kind of silence might have felt uneasy. But to Mimi, it was nothing new. She was focused on getting home, warming up, and maybe rereading the chapter she loved so much. A light flickered overhead, buzzing for a moment before going still again. Mimi barely noticed. She adjusted the strap of her purse, her thoughts drifting to tomorrow's shift, her upcoming classes, and the European literature trip she'd been saving for. She had plans. She had a future. She had everything lined up. But the world around her had shifted, subtle, quiet, unnoticed. A car idled somewhere behind her. She didn't look back. Why would she? To her, it was just another person heading home after a long day. Her apartment building wasn't far now. Just a few turns, a short stretch of sidewalk, and she'd be at her door. But as she entered the darker, narrow strip between the corner store and the row of older houses, something in the air felt heavier, less familiar. Her steps slowed, almost instinctively, like her body recognized a threat her mind couldn't name. A shadow moved behind her. Not fast, not loud, just present. She quickened her pace, her breath turning uneven, her fingers tightening around her purse. She wasn't running, but she wasn't strolling anymore either. Then, a sudden scuffle. A short, sharp gasp. One muffled sound, swallowed by the cold night. After that, nothing. The street returned to silence, as if the world itself decided to pretend she had never been there. Mimi Schlais had vanished. The call came to the station just after noon, voices clipped, the sort that make even practiced officers pause. Two boys, skipping school and wandering where they shouldn't have been, had found something in the brush. An officer drove out, boots sinking into mud softened by the recent rain, and then he saw her. The scene stole the breath from every person who arrived. They found Mimi where the trees opened onto a small clearing, as if someone had chosen that spot and left her there like a statement. Her body showed signs of a terrible struggle. Bruises, abrasions, signs of force. The medical examiner would later list blunt force trauma and strangulation as the cause, but in that raw moment, the technical words couldn't hold the weight of the grief. Detectives cordoned the area, trying to keep the place from being swallowed by gawkers and whispers. A plaster cast was taken of a single, size, 1-0 footprint in the mud, a single physical anchor in a case otherwise full of questions. Nearby, her clutch purse was nowhere to be seen, though later a few blocks away someone would find her ID and a small amount of cash oddly discarded, as if whoever did this wanted the trail to be confusing. For the Schlais family, the discovery ripped hope open and emptied the rest. For a city that once slept with confidence, the discovery shoved fear sideways into every late-night walk and every empty bus stop. And yet, even with the scene photographed, sketched, and catalogued, the one thing that might later prove decisive lay quietly preserved. A trace of biological evidence, fragile and small, that 1974's tools could not fully interpret. It was the only whisper left to carry Mimi's story forward if time and future science were merciful. Mimi Schlais had a way of lighting up rooms without even trying. Friends called her Mimi because it felt intimate, personal, like you were part of her circle just by knowing her. At 24, she carried herself with a calm purpose that belied her youth. Every decision she made seemed measured, intentional, a plan laid carefully for a future she refused to leave to chance. Her dream was clear. Study literature overseas, immerse herself in cultures, learn from the masters she admired. Every paycheck from the Blue Plate special wasn't just money, it was a step closer to that dream. Every late night, serving coffee, wiping counters, and laughing with coworkers was part of a pattern that brought her closer to the life she envisioned. Her family, Dorian and Vivian, described her as the kind of daughter who radiated hope. Even in ordinary moments, her energy was contagious, a reminder that small actions, a smile, a gesture, could change someone's day. That very energy, however, was a double-edged sword. It made her a magnet for attention, some of it unwanted, though Mimi rarely noticed. She trusted the world too easily, believing kindness could travel as far as malice. Yet, the calm precision of her plans was what made the night of November 1st so unthinkable. A life mapped with intention, a routine so familiar, and suddenly gone. How could someone vanish from the path they walked so often? How could a young woman with every corner of her life planned out be taken without a trace? Mimi's life followed a rhythm that was comforting to her and familiar to everyone who knew her. Each night, she left the Blue Plate special at the same hour, walked the same streets, and arrived at her apartment within minutes. It was a route she could travel with her eyes closed, each lamppost and cracked sidewalk a silent companion to her steps. That predictability, once a source of ease, would become the detail that made her vulnerable. She stopped occasionally to greet neighbors, exchanged polite nods with late-night workers, and sometimes lingered in thought, imagining her trip abroad, or planning her next literature assignment. To her, these were ordinary pauses in an ordinary night. To someone else, watching from the shadows, they were opportunities. Every predictable step, every familiar turn, created a map of her life that only a patient observer could follow. Her coworkers often commented on how responsible she was, never cutting corners, always planning. Brenda, who had walked Mimi to the street corner countless times, noticed how Mimi's careful nature extended to her surroundings, checking doors, crossing at the right spots, keeping her purse close. Yet, even in these careful movements, no alarm bell rang. The pattern was so ordinary, it made her invisible in a world that might be watching. It's a thought that chills even today. A young woman, trusted by everyone, safe in the rhythm of her life, and yet entirely exposed. The streets she knew like the back of her hand had transformed into an unseen stage for a crime that no one could have anticipated. Brenda Olson replayed that night in her mind countless times afterward. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Mimi waving goodbye, joking about finishing her shift early, the familiar clink of cutlery behind them in the diner. But now, every small detail carried weight she hadn't recognized. The way Mimi had paused at the street corner, glancing over her shoulder as if sensing movement. The quick, almost imperceptible shiver as a cold wind cut through the alley. The small purse she clutched tighter than usual. Brenda had noticed each of these things and dismissed them. Ordinary quirks of a young woman on her way home. That dismissal became a wound. The subtle signs that someone might have been watching, waiting, lingering just out of sight. Brenda realized she had ignored them. She could see it now. The shadow on the sidewalk that hadn't been a shadow. The rustle in the bushes that wasn't just wind. The truth that stared her in the face, too late. Regret gnawed at her. If only I had walked her partway home. If only I had insisted she call me when she got in. She would whisper to herself. Each recollection was a fresh pang of guilt, a reminder that danger often hides in plain sight, waiting for the unguarded moment to strike. The tension of that night, the invisible threads that had gone unnoticed, foreshadowed the horror that awaited, a predictable life, a trusted route, a friend unaware of the storm brewing around her steps, and it ended in tragedy. The weight of missed cues pressed not just on Brenda, but on everyone who had assumed safety and familiarity. It was a chilling reminder. Even the smallest signs deserve attention, especially when someone's life hangs in the balance. The night air held an almost ordinary chill, the kind that makes streetlights blur and shadows deepen. No one could have guessed that someone was waiting in those shadows, watching Mimi's familiar path as she made her way home. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The streets she walked nightly were suddenly a stage, each step echoing in the ears of someone who had studied her routine for weeks, maybe months. Mimi, oblivious to the presence that lingered nearby, hummed softly to herself, thinking of her plans, the literature she loved, the trip she hoped to take. That trust, that innocence, made her life a target. The unseen eyes tracked every turn, every pause, every cautious glance she gave her surroundings. Even the smallest gestures, adjusting her coat, checking her purse, were recorded by someone who had no intention of letting her reach her apartment safely. It was a presence that had gone unnoticed, one that wouldn't leave a single clue visible to those who believed the city was safe at night. And here's the chilling thought for everyone watching. These patterns, these predictable routines, they aren't always harmless. Someone could be watching right now, learning, waiting. Ever had a moment you wish you took more seriously? It's in those moments that danger finds a path. Subscribe so you don't miss cases just like this. Real supporters hit subscribe. Not tomorrow. Not later. Right now. Mimi's steps faded into the darkness, unaware that the world she trusted was shifting into a nightmare. Every familiar street corner, every familiar shadow, held the unseen threat that would define the horror of November 1st, 1000, 974. The blue plate special buzzed with the usual early morning chatter, the clatter of dishes, and the hiss of the coffee machine. But something was off. One chair remained empty, one apron unworn. One familiar smile never appeared behind the counter. Co-workers exchanged uneasy glances. "Where's Mimi?" someone whispered, a question that grew heavier with each passing minute. The routine had been broken, the predictable rhythm of life interrupted by an absence no one could explain. Brenda's heart skipped as she called out her friend's name, only to be met with silence. The diner felt colder, the space larger, and the normal morning sounds transformed into a chorus of tension. Orders came and went, but the empty spot behind the counter was a constant reminder. Each ringing bell above the door, each clink of a plate, only amplified the sense that the ordinary had collapsed. Customers noticed the discomfort, whispered among themselves, but no one dared voice the growing fear. The staff tried to fill in, to act as though nothing had changed, but the absence of Mimi made every movement awkward, every smile forced. It was more than a missing employee, it was a rupture in the fabric of a familiar world. The diner that had once been warm and predictable now felt fragile, like the first crack in a window before it shatters. Panic began its slow creep, subtle, yet unrelenting. The empty chair became a symbol, a warning, a question that demanded an answer, and for everyone present, the fear gnawed quietly. Something unseen had stepped in, and it had taken Mimi. Dorian and Vivian Schlais woke to the same routines they had followed for years. But on this morning, an unease clung to the edges of their consciousness. The phone rang, once, twice, unanswered. There was no knock at the door, no cheerful greeting from Mimi as she prepared for her day. A sinking feeling grew in Dorian's chest. He tried to convince himself that Mimi had simply overslept, caught up in studying or errands, yet each passing moment stretched longer than the last, and the possibility that something was wrong refused to leave. Vivian's mind raced. Had Mimi missed her bus? Had she been delayed by a friend? Each scenario, ordinary at first glance, twisted darker with the absence of any word from their daughter. The couple called friends, neighbors, and even the diner, but the answers only deepened their dread. "She didn't come in," someone finally confirmed. Dorian's hand shook as he gripped the receiver. The polite, reassuring voices on the other end of the line felt hollow. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't a typical morning mishap. Every passing minute was a reminder of the fragility of certainty. The house felt quieter than usual, the walls too close, the air heavier. The Schlais' hearts thudded with a fear they could not name, the knowledge that the safety they had assumed was an illusion. The transition from ordinary to terrifying was almost imperceptible, but in that shift, a new reality emerged. Mimi was missing, and the world that had always promised security now offered only a gnawing uncertainty. The first seeds of dread took root, and nothing would ever feel safe again. The Schlaises arrived at Mimi's apartment just as the first morning light filtered through the city streets. The front door was locked, the windows dark, the familiar hum of home absent. The space she had left in perfect order, her bed neatly made, her books stacked, her belongings untouched, offered no explanation. It was as if Mimi had evaporated, leaving only the outline of her life behind. Her Ford Maverick sat in the parking lot, undisturbed, tires cold against the asphalt. Everything suggested routine, normalcy, even care. Yet the emptiness inside screamed otherwise. Dorian ran his hands along the doorknob, feeling the cold metal, wishing that a simple twist would reveal her presence. The apartment remained silent, unwilling to provide answers to frantic parents. Vivian's eyes scanned the rooms, taking in the ordinary details that had once been comforting. The neatly made bed, the coffee mug from the night before, the coat hanging where Mimi had left it, all of it, now a stark reminder that something had been stolen, not just from the city streets, but from their lives. Neighbors watched from across the hall, whispers exchanged, uncertain looks cast. The sense of normal life had fractured in a single morning. The walls of the apartment seemed to absorb the panic, reflecting it back in cold silence. For the Schlaises, this was no longer a case of a missed morning. The signs, subtle but undeniable, pointed to a reality they had never imagined. Their daughter had vanished without explanation, and the apartment, once a place of warmth and safety, refused to speak, leaving only questions and an ever-growing dread. The phone rang at the Milwaukee Police Department just as the morning sun began to pierce the chill of November 2nd, 1974. Detective Thornburg answered, expecting a routine report or perhaps another small complaint from the city. What he heard instead made him freeze. A trembling voice, barely audible over the line, reported a body discovered in a wooded area on the outskirts of town. Curtis and Dean, two teenage boys, had been skipping school when they stumbled across something that would haunt them forever. They didn't yet understand the magnitude, but the officers on the line did. Every instinct screamed that this was not a simple accident. Within minutes, police cars, ambulances, and investigators flooded the area. The forest, ordinary and quiet only hours before, now held the weight of horror. Officers moved carefully through the skeletal trees, each step crunching the frost-hardened leaves, hearts pounding in sync with the news that had shattered routine. Meanwhile, Dorian and Vivian, still reeling from the emptiness of Mimi's apartment, were finally confronted with the reality their instincts had whispered all along. The fear that had begun as a gnawing uncertainty now solidified into unbearable dread. Their daughter was gone, and now the unimaginable had become true. For everyone involved, the morning that began with ordinary routines had collapsed into a nightmare. And as the investigation began, a terrifying thought pressed into the minds of all who heard the news. The killer had left nothing behind that would immediately identify him. If this case already has your heart racing, subscribe. Don't just sit there. The scene in the woods was silent but screaming, a prelude to a decades-long search for answers, a search that would stretch across 49 years before the truth finally emerged. In 1974, forensic science was a far cry from the digital and DNA-driven investigations of today. Detectives Thornburg and O'Malley knew they had tangible evidence at the scene, yet the tools to unlock its secrets simply did not exist. Fingerprints could be compared, fibers examined, and footprints measured. But the microscopic traces of blood, hair, and bodily fluids, now considered critical, offered only limited clues. At the woods where Mimi Schlais's life ended, investigators carefully documented every detail. The fallen leaves, the frost-hardened soil, and the scattered items from her last moments were noted, photographed, and collected. Each piece of evidence was a frozen whisper, preserved in the hope that one day, science might catch up to the crime. Yet, in real time, it felt like chasing shadows. Leads emerged, but none could hold weight. Suspects were questioned, timelines drawn, and comparisons made, all yielding dead ends. The frustration among officers was immense. Every pattern they tried to trace, every connection attempted, collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. The crime was brutal, controlled, and precise. Yet the forensics of the era offered only fragments, never the full picture. The mystery deepened with every inconclusive test, every unyielding sample. It was a stark reminder that justice sometimes moves slower than crime. The tools at their disposal could only scratch the surface, leaving the Schlais family in agonizing limbo, and the community with a gnawing fear that the perpetrator could vanish back into ordinary life without consequence. The evidence was there waiting, silent, impossible to interpret fully in its time. Among the scattered evidence in the woods, one detail immediately caught the attention of investigators. A muddy footprint pressed deeply into the damp earth. The size 1-0 impression, stark against the cold soil, suggested weight, presence, and intent. To capture it for further analysis, Officers carefully encased it in plaster, preserving the shape with painstaking precision. The footprint became a symbol of both hope and frustration. It was concrete, tangible, something that could one day lead them to the person responsible for taking Mimi Schlais's life. Yet in 1974, there was no database, no digital repository, no method to instantly match it to a suspect. The print offered direction but no answers. Every lead generated from it led to another dead end. Detectives studied the cast again and again, hoping for a breakthrough. They compared it with shoes owned by individuals in the neighborhood, local drifters, and known offenders. Patterns were noted, suspicions raised, but nothing conclusive emerged. The footprint, meant to reveal the killer, instead became a silent taunt, a proof of presence that could not identify a face. For the Schlais family, it was another layer of torment. Here was evidence that someone had been there, close enough to commit an unimaginable act, yet untouchable by the law. The plaster cast sat in evidence lockers, a preserved reminder of both the crime and the limitations of the era. The impression in the earth remained frozen in time, a haunting detail that would one day, decades later, provide a critical link to justice. As investigators combed through the scene, a baffling inconsistency emerged. Mimi's small clutch purse, which she had carried from the diner, was nowhere to be found. Yet, her identification card and a modest sum of cash were discovered a few streets away, discarded in a seemingly random spot. The contradiction confounded detectives. Why leave some personal items while taking others? The logic behind such selective removal eluded them. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Was this an attempt to mislead the police? A cruel game played by someone who wanted the world to search blindly. Every hypothesis seemed plausible, yet fell short under scrutiny. Neighbors were questioned, routines traced, and potential witnesses re-interviewed, but each lead disintegrated, leaving only more confusion. The missing purse and displaced possessions became emblematic of the case itself, tantalizing hints that pointed toward a resolution, yet stubbornly withholding closure. Every clue demanded attention, but none could anchor the investigation. The footprint, the purse, the scattered belongings, all were pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. Detectives grappled with the frustration, aware that time was slipping away. Each day without progress deepened the fear in the community, and the Schlais family endured another layer of anguish. The evidence collected in 1974 was solid, yet incomplete, like a story half told, leaving the truth just beyond reach. This growing uncertainty planted the seeds for decades of silence and unspoken dread. The case became a haunting reminder that sometimes even the most promising clues could collapse under the weight of mystery, leaving only questions that would wait for future technology to answer. Among the collected evidence, there was one element that even 1,974's best investigators could not fully utilize: the biological traces left behind blood, hair, and other microscopic evidence. It was preserved carefully, frozen in evidence lockers, a silent testament to a crime that had shaken Milwaukee. Detectives Thornburg and O'Malley recognized its potential, even if the science of the time could not unlock its secrets. This silent evidence represented a future hope. Each day, as leads dried up and witnesses' memories faded, it remained intact, patiently waiting for technology to advance. In the context of the era, it felt almost cruel, a key to justice that could not be turned. The frustration was compounded by the brutality of the crime, the innocence of the victim, and the persistent inability to identify the perpetrator. Decades would pass, yet the evidence remained, untouched by time's passage, except for the careful preservation by dedicated officers. It symbolized both failure and promise. The crime unsolved, yet a future breakthrough, quietly encoded in every preserved sample. Cases like this stay unsolved for decades. Don't risk missing updates. Subscribe. People who care about justice subscribe. The silent traces in the evidence lockers were a whisper that justice might one day be achieved. Though invisible to the eyes of 1,974, these fragments of truth would eventually speak, revealing the identity of a killer who had walked free for decades. They were a grim reminder that sometimes the most crucial answers lie in patience, persistence, and science waiting for its time to act. The streets of Milwaukee grew quieter in the nights following Mimi Schlais's disappearance. Women returning from late shifts, students walking home after studying, and those taking evening errands began to measure every step with caution. Ordinary routines became exercises in vigilance. Shadows on empty sidewalks were no longer innocuous. Every flicker of movement sparked a shiver of fear. Residents locked doors earlier, checked windows obsessively, and exchanged worried glances at unfamiliar faces. Mothers called their children to hurry inside, and neighbors found themselves double-checking that familiar streets were safe. The city, usually bustling with a sense of modest safety, now held a persistent undertone of dread. Every passing stranger became a question mark. Could this be the person responsible? Every quiet street corner demanded suspicion. Conversations in grocery stores, laundromats, and diners shifted toward whispered warnings and cautious speculation. The collective anxiety of a community unable to reconcile a heinous crime with its everyday reality became palpable in ways both visible and unspoken. Parents of young adults felt the fear multiply. Fathers walked daughters home themselves, while students altered routines to avoid late-night outings. The simplest choices, a walk after work, a stroll to a nearby shop, now carried hidden tension. For many, the memory of that night never fully dissipated, and the unknown perpetrator became a phantom lingering in every quiet alley and dimly lit street. The citizens of Milwaukee, once confident in their daily movements, now approached life with the weight of suspicion pressing down. Fear reshaped the ordinary, turning routine journeys into calculated risks and transforming an entire city into a place that had, quite literally, lost sleep. In the weeks following Mimi's disappearance, stories began to circulate faster than the truth could keep pace. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, each adding fragments of assumption to the tale. Every unexplained movement, every unfamiliar face, became fuel for speculation. Innocent actions were reinterpreted through the lens of fear. Rumors stretched across the city like wildfire. Some claimed to have seen someone loitering near the diner that night. Others suggested that someone in the neighborhood knew more than they let on. Each story was told with increasing drama, gaining detail and credibility with every retelling. The uncertainty of the crime created a fertile ground for imagination and fear. Neighborhoods turned suspicious. People eyed their own friends and family members warily. Casual acquaintances became potential suspects. Trust eroded, a team replaced by doubt that shadowed every interaction. The community, already on edge, began to fragment under the weight of unverified claims. Even local businesses weren't immune. Patrons hesitated to venture out late at night. Conversations about the case were inevitable, and the tension seeped into every corner of daily life. No one could be certain who was safe, or who might harbor a hidden danger. Through all of this, the truth of what had actually happened to Mimi remained elusive. The combination of fear and rumor amplified the city's anxiety, creating a collective tension that would linger for months. It was a constant reminder that a single, violent act could ripple outward, unsettling an entire community long after the crime itself. The Blue Plate Special, once a place of laughter, chatter, and late-night meals, transformed into a space heavy with absence. Chairs sat unoccupied, where Mimi used to laugh with co-workers. Her favorite booth remained empty, a quiet testament to the girl who had vanished too soon. The aroma of coffee and frying bacon now carried an undertone of grief. Customers, co-workers, and neighbors began to treat the diner as a makeshift memorial. Flowers appeared at the entrance, candles flickered on windowsills, and handwritten notes left messages of remembrance. Every patron who had known Mimi felt the weight of her absence. Her presence, once ordinary and taken for granted, was now deeply missed in every corner. Employees of the diner, particularly Brenda, struggled to continue work as before. The rhythms of serving tables and taking orders became exercises in holding back emotion. Each familiar routine reminded them of the last night they saw her, the smiles shared, the casual jokes that now felt unbearably fleeting. The diner, intentionally or not, became a reflection of the city's collective mourning. Conversations often turned to memories of Mimi, stories of her kindness, her laughter, her dreams of studying abroad. Visitors came not only to eat, but to honor her memory, leaving tokens, photos, and messages of sorrow and hope. In this quiet transformation, the Blue Plate Special became more than a diner. It became a symbol of the community's attempt to hold on to normalcy while processing a tragedy that had shattered it. The space bore witness to grief, remembrance, and the subtle, unspoken tension that hung over Milwaukee in the aftermath of Mimi Schlais's disappearance. For Dorian and Vivian Schlais, the pain of Mimi's absence extended beyond the confines of home. In public, they carried themselves with a quiet dignity, answering questions from concerned neighbors, reporters, and acquaintances. Every inquiry reminded them of the cruel reality. Their daughter was gone, and no one knew why or how. Yet behind closed doors, the grief was relentless. Their home became a place of rituals, checking her room, revisiting the last notes she had written, staring at photographs that captured her radiant smile frozen in time. Each evening brought the same unending questions. Where had she gone? Who had taken her? Could she have fought back? Every unanswered question compounded the ache in their hearts. Even small interactions carried weight. A casual greeting on the street, a familiar face in a crowd, each encounter risked a jolt of recognition. A fear that Mimi's absence might touch someone else. That danger could lurk closer than anyone realized. Their sorrow was a quiet, constant companion, shaping how they moved through the world, how they engaged with neighbors, and how they endured each passing day. The community's attempts at comfort offered little relief. Friends and extended family could only share in moments of support, but the true depth of loss was theirs alone. Milwaukee, a city already tense from rumors and suspicion, watched the Schlais family navigate the duality of grief. Publicly stoic, privately shattered. Amidst this enduring sorrow, one question lingered over the city and family alike. Who could commit such an act? And would justice ever arrive? The absence of answers stretched the pain, casting a shadow over every street, every corner, every ordinary moment. Who would you suspect first? Detectives Thornburg and O'Malley approached the Schlais case with a relentless intensity that consumed both their days and nights. Each lead, no matter how small, became a thread they could not ignore. Coffee-stained notes, witness statements, and neighborhood observations filled their desks, evidence of a commitment few could match. The weight of responsibility pressed on them. A young life had been taken, and it was their duty to find answers. They pored over schedules, mapping every movement Mimi might have taken after leaving the diner. Patterns, routines, and habits were dissected for clues, and each possibility examined from multiple angles. Every small observation mattered. Whether it was a detail from Brenda's account or a fleeting sighting from a passerby. These men chased the shadows of uncertainty with determination, refusing to let the case fade into the quiet despair that so often claimed unsolved crimes. Their obsession was not only professional but personal. Both detectives understood the anguish of a family left in limbo, of a community shrouded in fear. This understanding drove them to work beyond regular hours, often returning to the office late at night to review notes, compare timelines, and brainstorm theories. Yet, as dedicated as they were, every solved lead seemed to vanish under the limitations of the era. Despite endless efforts, frustration mounted. Each day brought hope that somehow a breakthrough would appear, but every dead end reminded them of the challenges ahead. Still, they pressed on, aware that Mimi's voice, quiet in life, silenced in death, deserved justice. Their unyielding focus laid the foundation for decades of investigation that would eventually connect the dots in ways 1974 could not imagine. Detectives Thornburg and O'Malley pursued every lead, no matter how minor it seemed. They returned to the Blue Plate Special repeatedly, questioning co-workers and patrons about any unusual behavior the night Mimi vanished. Each recollection, however small, was treated as potentially critical. Friends mentioned fleeting glances from strangers. Neighbors recalled unfamiliar cars idling too long near her apartment. Every fragment of information was catalogued and cross-referenced. They also focused on physical evidence. The muddy size, 1-0 footprint, became a centerpiece of their investigation. Shoe owners in the area were questioned, their alibis meticulously checked. Yet, as promising as this lead seemed, it produced no conclusive results. Every theory formed against the backdrop of the footprint seemed to evaporate just as quickly. Interrogations of local suspects brought tension and fleeting hope, only to collapse under scrutiny. A man with a past arrest for assault seemed promising until his timeline proved airtight. Another individual's nervousness suggested guilt, yet nothing tied him directly to the crime. Frustration began to mount as their efforts were met with the cold, unyielding reality of 1974's investigative tools. Despite these obstacles, the detectives persisted, understanding that patience was as crucial as persistence. They documented everything, building a detailed map of the night Mimi disappeared and following up on inconsistencies wherever they appeared. Every lead that faded deepened the tension, and the detectives were left balancing hope and despair. Each failure, however, only reinforced their resolve to uncover the truth, aware that the smallest breakthrough could eventually expose the answers hidden for decades. The year was 1974, and the tools at Thornburg and O'Malley's disposal were limited. Fingerprints could be analyzed, alibis checked, and witness statements cross-referenced, but the groundbreaking forensic methods of the future were decades away. DNA profiling did not yet exist, and biological evidence, no matter how carefully collected, remained largely unhelpful. Each dead end was a reminder of the era's limitations. Investigators could painstakingly preserve blood samples, hairs, or fibers, yet their potential remained untapped. Frustration became a constant companion. Every lead that showed promise seemed to vanish under the weight of inadequate technology, leaving the detectives in a near-constant state of professional despair. Communication between departments was slower, databases were primitive, and record-keeping could only take them so far. The single plaster-cast footprint offered tantalizing hope, but no definitive answers. The detectives spent hours matching it against local shoe sizes, yet nothing concrete emerged. It was as if the evidence was taunting them, whispering the truth just out of reach. Despite these hurdles, Thornburg and O'Malley refused to give in. Each day, they returned to the field, retracing Mimi's last known steps, re-interviewing witnesses, and questioning anyone who might have crossed paths with her. Their commitment was unwavering, even as the reality of their era worked against them. The limitations of 1974 made the case a labyrinth with invisible walls. The detectives' frustration was palpable, their obsession intensified by the knowledge that answers existed but were inaccessible. Every failed attempt only strengthened their resolve, setting the stage for future breakthroughs decades later. Among the fragments of evidence collected in 1974, one piece held quiet, enduring significance: a trace of biological material found at the scene. At the time, it was stored carefully, but its potential remained untapped, a silent whisper, waiting for science to catch up. Thornburg and O'Malley understood its importance, even if they could not act on it fully. The preserved evidence became both a symbol of hope and a source of torment. They could envision the answers it might reveal, the justice it could deliver. Yet for decades, it would offer nothing more than a promise. Every report, every note, Every carefully catalogued vial was a testament to their foresight, an acknowledgement that one day technology might unlock the secrets long held by the case. This whisper was more than DNA. It was a reminder of the girl they had failed to protect. It represented the unanswered questions, the grief of her family, and the city's lingering fear. Detectives revisited the evidence repeatedly, knowing that while it could not speak in 1974, it carried a story that time might one day reveal. Each passing year made the whisper quieter, the case colder, and the trail fainter, yet the detectives never abandoned it. Every effort, every lead, every painstaking interview added context for the future, for the day when science might finally provide the answers they sought. As the 1,970 seconds ended and the case gradually went cold, the preserved evidence remained, quietly waiting, a dormant key to unlocking decades of unanswered questions. Its significance was understood, but untouchable. A ghost of possibility lingering in the shadows of the investigation. With leads frozen and frustration mounting, the case teetered on the edge of obscurity, holding its secrets close for decades. The years stretched forward like an unbroken winter, each one colder than the last for Dorian and Vivian Schlais. Their lives continued, outwardly ordinary, but inside, the weight of Mimi's absence was a constant companion. Friends drifted away, neighbors changed, yet the memory of their daughter remained vivid, etched into the very walls of their home. Every November first reopened old wounds. Every evening brought the silent reminder of a daughter who never returned. For the city, life moved on. New diners opened where the Blue Plate Special had once hummed with chatter. Streets were repaved, streetlights replaced, and the next generation grew up unaware of the shadow lingering in Milwaukee's past. Yet, for those who remembered, Mimi's story never left. Parents whispered warnings to their children, while munning with some country. Women avoided late-night walks, and local lore carried the cautionary tale of a girl whose life was stolen too soon. Even as decades passed, Dorian and Vivian refused to let hope fade entirely. Flyers they had distributed for years, now yellowed and torn, were tucked away in boxes as silent vows to a daughter they could not forget. Every unopened letter, every unanswered lead, was a reminder that while the city sought to move forward, the pain of unresolved tragedy refused to let them go. The passage of time hardened the case in the eyes of some, turning it into an unsolved mystery, a ghost story whispered in passing conversations. But to the Schlais family, to those who remembered, Mimi's absence was as present as ever, a call for justice that no clock, no calendar, and no 30-year winter could silence. Even as the city adapted to its own rhythm, Mimi's story lingered in Milwaukee like an unhealed wound. Residents who had witnessed the early shock still recalled the panic that gripped the streets that November. Mothers warned their daughters, friends exchanged hushed conversations, and every late-night walk became a quiet test of courage. The city may have rebuilt, but the shadow of Mimi's absence remained. The Blue Plate Special, once filled with laughter and familiar faces, eventually closed. Patrons moved on, unaware that each plate served had once been touched by a girl whose life would end tragically. Yet those who remembered the employees, the neighbors, the friends carried the memory of Mimi forward. She became a symbol of vigilance, of lives cut short, and of justice delayed. Stories of her disappearance and the chilling discovery of her body were retold, evolving into whispered legends. The community's fear slowly transformed into resolve. Local historians, writers, and journalists chronicled the case, keeping it in the public eye. Even as time softened the edges of memory, the emotional imprint remained. The quiet tension of that fateful night was still palpable in conversations, anniversaries, and remembrances. A reminder that unresolved tragedy leaves an invisible scar on an entire city. Through these decades, the collective memory of Mimi Schlais did more than haunt, it educated. It reminded parents to watch over their children. It made strangers cautious, and it cemented a civic awareness that danger could be closer than anyone realized. In its way, the city itself honored her memory, keeping alive a story that refused to be buried, ensuring that the girl who vanished in 1974 would not be forgotten. By the early 2000s, the Milwaukee Police Department recognized that decades of unsolved cases needed a renewed focus. Among them, the disappearance and murder of Mary Schlais stood out not only for its brutality, but for the enduring pain it inflicted on her family and the community. With modern forensic science on the horizon, the city established a cold case unit, tasking fresh investigators with examining crimes left unresolved. Mimi's case file, thick with yellowed papers, witness statements, and photographs, was handed to this new team. Every note, every piece of evidence, was carefully reviewed. The preserved biological sample, the silent whisper of a crime long hidden, was catalogued with renewed importance. Detectives approached the case with eyes unclouded by decades of frustration, seeing possibilities that were inconceivable in 1974. The arrival of modern technology, combined with fresh determination, reignited hope. Investigators pored over maps, old interviews, and overlooked details, piecing together a narrative that might finally expose the killer. Even after 30 years, there was a sense that justice was still achievable. The whispers of the past began to speak louder, urging detectives not to let the decades of silence be wasted. For the Schlais family, this renewal was bittersweet. The pain of waiting nearly half a century remained, but now it was coupled with cautious optimism. Every analysis, every revisit of the evidence, became a small victory in a battle long thought unwinnable. The city watched silently as the cold case unit breathed new life into a story that refused to fade completely. Tell us in the comments, should old cases always be reopened? If you believe forgotten victims deserve justice, subscribe. Don't be passive. Detective Lena Petrova was not the type to let a case rest quietly. From her earliest days in law enforcement, she had been driven by a singular principle: no victim should be forgotten. Her colleagues often noted her relentless focus, but to Petrova, it wasn't obsession, it was duty. She carried a moral compass that pointed unwaveringly toward justice, even when the path was long, dark, and littered with dead ends. Assigned to the newly formed cold case unit in Milwaukee, Petrova quickly became known for taking on the files others had shelved decades earlier. Among the stack of yellowed papers and faded photographs sat the case of Mary Schlais. The story of the young woman who had vanished in 1974 only to be found brutally murdered days later was already legendary in the city, but Petrova saw it as unfinished business, a life demanding closure. Petrova studied the case with a methodical eye, noting not only the facts but the human pain threaded through each report. She could feel the echoes of fear and loss resonating from the pages, the despair that had shadowed Dorian and Vivian Schlais for nearly 30 years. This wasn't just another file, it was a voice demanding to be heard. As she examined the preserved biological evidence, Petrova envisioned what modern technology could achieve. The tiny samples, once silent, could now speak with precision unthinkable in 1974. She felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, a promise that the decades of waiting would not be wasted. Every decision from this point forward could bring the family long-awaited answers or dash hope against the wall of time. The stakes were clear. She could rewrite history, but only if she succeeded. Petrova took a deep breath and prepared to breathe life into a case that had been frozen for generations. Mimi Schlais's case file was immense, a labyrinth of handwritten notes, typed reports, photographs, and evidence logs. For decades, it had sat largely untouched, gathering dust while the world moved on. But to Detective Lena Petrova, each page was a lifeline, a thread connecting the present to a crime that demanded justice. She began systematically reviewing the material, line by line. Witness statements were scrutinized anew. The subtle inconsistencies and overlooked details leapt out with startling clarity. Brenda Olson's account, once catalogued as routine, now hinted at a timeline that could narrow the suspect pool. Every photograph of the crime scene, every plaster cast of a size 1-0 footprint, suddenly became a critical clue under her meticulous gaze. Petrova contrasted the investigative tools of the 1,970 seconds with the capabilities available today. Back then, evidence was limited to fingerprints, witness recollections, and rudimentary laboratory analysis. DNA profiling, as powerful as it was now, was a distant dream. This perspective made the preserved biological sample all the more precious, an opportunity to finally hear the voice of a crime long silenced. Her team cataloged and digitized the entire file, creating a living document that could be manipulated, cross-referenced, and tested in ways her predecessors could only have imagined. Petrova felt the tension mounting as the evidence came to life in a way that would have been impossible for Detectives Thornburg and O'Malley. Every detail mattered, every overlooked hint could point toward a breakthrough. As the hours stretched into days, the weight of responsibility pressed on her. The case was no longer just historical, it was immediate. Each page, each artifact, carried the potential to close a chapter that had haunted a family and a city for decades. For Petrova, the mission was clear. Bring the past into the light, before it was too late. The preserved sample from 1974 was microscopic, nearly invisible to the naked eye, yet it held the key to solving a decades-old puzzle. Detective Petrova knew that short tandem repeat, STR, DNA profiling, could turn that silent fragment into a powerful witness. Unlike older methods, STR analysis didn't just identify biological material, it could map unique genetic sequences that were exclusive to an individual. Petrova explained the process to her team in terms they could grasp. STR profiling isolates specific patterns in the DNA, like a series of repeating sequences that, when compared against a database, could lead investigators to a match. Each sequence served as a fingerprint, invisible yet unmistakable. It was painstaking work, but the potential payoff, finally naming the person responsible for Mimi's death, was enormous. The lab technicians worked with surgical precision, knowing that the fragile sample had survived nearly half a century. Every step from extraction to amplification required absolute care. A single misstep could render the evidence useless. Petrova watched the procedure with unwavering focus, understanding the stakes. The past and present converged in this tiny vial. As the sequences began to emerge, a new tension gripped the team. Each fragment of genetic code was a whisper from the night Mimi vanished, a voice frozen in time that now had the chance to speak. Petrova felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Any revelation could bring justice, but it could also shatter the fragile peace of a community unprepared for the truth. By the end of the day, the STR profile was successfully compiled. The silent whisper from 1974 had become a coherent message. It was now a tool that could reach beyond the limits of the past, a bridge between decades of darkness and the light of resolution. Petrova was ready to take the next step. Forensic genealogy. With the STR profile in hand, Detective Petrova faced the next critical decision. Take the case into the realm of forensic genealogy. Unlike standard DNA searches, this method didn't rely on direct matches in criminal databases. Instead, it analyzed genetic markers to identify distant relatives, sometimes several generations removed. It was a powerful tool, but one that demanded patience, skill, and absolute precision. Petrova knew the stakes were high. If the sample failed or the analysis led nowhere, decades of hope could collapse in an instant. Yet the potential was undeniable. This approach could finally reveal the man who had haunted Milwaukee for nearly 50 years. The tiniest misstep might erase decades of painstaking work, but a calculated success could rewrite history for Mimi's family and the community. The process began with uploading the STR data to genealogy databases, comparing it against millions of users' profiles to find shared DNA segments. Each hit offered a thread of connection, sometimes a third cousin, sometimes more distant. Petrova's team traced these threads through records, cross-referencing birth certificates, marriage licenses, and historical documents. Slowly, a family tree began to emerge, pointing toward a specific branch, narrowing the circle of potential suspects. The tension in the room was palpable. Every lead carried weight. Every genealogical intersection could be the breakthrough or a dead end. Petrova felt the quiet pressure of decades of unanswered questions pressing on her shoulders. If this worked, she would finally give a voice to Schlais, a voice that had been silenced for far too long. Hours stretched into days. Then, weeks. But finally, the extraction bore fruit. The evidence was intact, the STR profile viable, and the genealogical mapping had begun pointing unmistakably toward a living suspect. For the first time since 1974, the cold case was moving from uncertainty toward truth. Detective Petrova watched the monitor, heart pounding, as the STR profile from Schlais's 1,974 case was uploaded to CODIS, the national DNA database for convicted offenders. It was the moment that could finally end decades of uncertainty. Every technician in the lab held their breath. Years of painstaking work, modern technology, and forensic ingenuity all led to this instant. Seconds ticked by. The database whirred, comparing millions of entries. Petrova's pulse quickened. Could it be that simple? Could justice finally arrive with a click? Then, the results appeared. No match. The disappointment hit like a physical blow. Years of anticipation evaporated in an instant. The killer had never been convicted of a crime that would place him in CODIS, or he had been careful enough to avoid detection entirely. Petrova clenched her fists, feeling the weight of Mimi's family's decades-long anguish pressing down on her. The silence of the lab was almost unbearable. This failure, however, was not defeat. Petrova knew that while CODIS had failed, the STR profile remained a powerful weapon. It was a tool that could reach beyond traditional law enforcement boundaries. She quickly pivoted, directing the team toward forensic genealogy, a method that could trace relatives instead of direct suspects. The idea was both daring and delicate. Follow the DNA trail through family trees, a path fraught with complexity, but one that could reveal the face of a murderer who had eluded justice for nearly 50 years. Petrova's resolve hardened. CODIS may have failed, but the truth was not gone. Every distant relative that appeared in the database was a potential thread leading to the man who had haunted Milwaukee since 1974. She looked at her team with steady eyes. The investigation was far from over. Most people never see justice. Subscribe to stay informed. Shifting from CODIS to genealogy databases was like entering an entirely new battlefield. Detective Petrova and her team now sought connections not to a criminal record, but to family lines, distant cousins, whose DNA might hold the key to the killer's identity. Each new match, no matter how remote, was a thread leading closer to the truth. The first hits were subtle. A third cousin here, a fourth cousin there. Each match carried partial DNA, overlaps that had to be carefully traced through historical records. Petrova pored over birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census data, mapping connections across generations. Every decision mattered. One misstep could send the investigation down a false path. The team began constructing a branching family tree. The distant relatives weren't suspects themselves, but their existence narrowed the possibilities. Each branch represented a clue, a narrowing of the field, and the tension in the lab mounted. The silence was thick, punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers and the quiet hum of computers. Then, a pattern began to emerge. The branches pointed toward a particular lineage in the greater Milwaukee area. One family, previously unknown to the investigation, began to stand out. The detective's pulse quickened. A potential suspect was hidden within these ordinary lives, decades removed from the crime scene, but now becoming unmistakably linked through the web of DNA. Petrova knew they were onto something significant. The distant cousins were no longer just names and numbers, they were markers, guiding the team closer to a man who had remained invisible for 49 years. The pieces were slowly aligning. Every connection, every shared marker, brought them closer to unmasking a figure who had long blended into society. As the genealogy analysis progressed, a critical branch of the family tree began to stand out. Detective Petrova's meticulous cross-referencing revealed multiple distant relatives, all pointing toward a single household in the greater Milwaukee area. The team's excitement was tempered with caution. After nearly 5 decades, a single misstep could shatter the fragile thread of progress. Petrova studied the records carefully. Birth certificates, public records, and archived news clippings painted the life of a man who, on the surface, appeared ordinary, even respectable. But the DNA trail was undeniable. For the first time, a living suspect's lineage emerged with enough certainty to warrant focused attention. The emerging suspect was Orion Kincaid, a retired postal worker with a long history in the neighborhood. For decades, his name had never surfaced in the original investigation, nor had his connections to the area raised suspicion. Yet here, through the intricate web of genetic markers, his presence became clear. Every distant cousin's DNA acted as a compass, pointing directly toward him. The revelation was both shocking and surreal. How could a man so ordinary, neighbors describing him as kind, helpful, and unassuming, be linked to a crime that had haunted the city for nearly 50 years? Petrova recognized the irony. The more mundane his life appeared, the more the contrast with the brutality of the Schlais case intensified. This breakthrough was a turning point. The genealogy evidence had identified a tangible target, transforming decades of uncertainty into focused action. Petrova's team now had the information they needed to move from speculation to investigation, from theory to confrontation. The city's long shadow of fear was about to collide with the undeniable truth, and nothing could prepare Milwaukee for the revelation that awaited. With Orion Kincaid's lineage clearly identified, Detective Petrova and her team shifted into high gear. The genealogy data had provided a family tree with multiple branches, but only a few individuals fit the geographic and temporal profile of the 1,974 crime. Each lead was scrutinized against old case files, witness statements, and historical addresses, narrowing the suspect circle further. The challenge was immense. 4 decades of normal life had left little trace of past behaviors, and Kincaid had no prior criminal record that would have placed him in CODIS. Yet every detail about his life, his age in 1974, proximity to the crime scene, daily routines matched perfectly with what the investigators had long sought. Petrova's team began comparing the DNA markers of distant relatives with the preserved biological evidence, ensuring consistency and accuracy at every step. Every match added confidence. Every discrepancy demanded a careful reevaluation. The weight of the decades pressing on the team was almost tangible. They were chasing a shadow, long thought untouchable. The tension in the room grew as the final possibilities were laid out. Out of dozens of names, only 3 men remained plausible candidates. Kincaid emerged as the primary person of interest, not because of suspicion in 1974, but because the genetic evidence left no ambiguity. It was precise, undeniable, and frighteningly direct. This narrowing of focus marked a turning point. The cold case had moved from the realm of memory and speculation to immediate action. Detective Petrova knew that they now had a clear path to uncovering the man responsible, and that every precaution and calculated move mattered. The team braced themselves. One small misstep could compromise the investigation, but the long-suppressed truth was closer than ever. The next phase would determine whether decades of patience would finally yield justice. With Orion Kincaid identified as the prime suspect, the team prepared for the next critical phase: collecting direct DNA without alerting him. This was delicate work. Kincaid had lived quietly for decades, respected in his community, with no criminal record to trigger suspicion. Any overt move could compromise the operation. Detective Petrova coordinated with undercover officers to observe Kincaid's routines. They mapped his daily habits, morning coffee stops, walks in the neighborhood, visits to the local VFW hall. Each observation was carefully recorded, analyzed, and cross-checked with historical data to predict the safest and most effective method to obtain a DNA sample. The team decided on a subtle approach, a discarded coffee cup at a cafe he frequented. It had to be completely untraceable, leaving no hint that law enforcement was watching. The pressure was immense. End quote. This single sample would determine the next steps of the investigation and could either confirm decades of work or force the team to start over. As the officers moved into position, the gravity of the moment was clear. 49 years of unanswered questions, grief, and fear were on the line. Every careful calculation and quiet maneuver carried the weight of the city's long-suffering family and community. Petrova's mind replayed the preserved evidence from 1974, the silent whisper that had waited decades for this moment. The contrast was staggering. A girl's life brutally taken, and a man who appeared ordinary living peacefully for nearly 5 decades. The team's collective focus was unwavering. One thing was certain. Once this DNA was collected and tested, there would be no turning back. The confrontation long postponed by time and circumstance was imminent, and the truth of that November night was about to resurface in full force. Orion Kincaid moved through his days in Milwaukee's quiet suburbs like any devoted neighbor, unaware that the shadows of his past would soon resurface. Mornings began with a short walk down tree-lined streets, a newspaper tucked under his arm, greeting fellow residents with a practiced warmth. At the local VFW hall, he was a familiar figure serving meals at community events, lending a hand during small renovations, and volunteering to organize local fundraisers. Neighbors remembered him as someone who never asked for recognition, always quietly attentive to the needs of others. His garden was a point of pride, where rows of marigolds and tulips bloomed under his care. On weekends, he could be seen trimming hedges or repairing fences, the kind of small gestures that earn admiration over decades. Children waved as he passed by, trusting in his approachable demeanor. Adults smiled back, assuming the life they saw reflected the entirety of the man. Yet, under this calm exterior, a decades-old crime remained locked away, a secret preserved by time and circumstance. The contrast between the harmless, courteous neighbor and the man capable of unthinkable violence weighed heavily on those tasked with uncovering the truth. Detective Petrova understood this contradiction could shatter the community's sense of safety once revealed. Even as Kincaid carried on his routine, law enforcement quietly observed, noting habits, daily movements, and interactions. Every handshake, every wave, every smile would now be viewed under the lens of suspicion. But the outside world remained blissfully unaware. It was this juxtaposition, the ordinary life built upon a foundation of hidden evil, that would shock the city, testing the limits of what people could believe about someone they had trusted for decades. Orion Kincaid was woven into the social fabric of his neighborhood in ways that made the revelation of his secret almost unimaginable. He attended every holiday gathering, brought treats to block parties, and celebrated birthdays with quiet generosity. His wife, Doris, often recounted how he would spend hours helping neighbors with repairs, never seeking acknowledgement or praise. To those around him, he was the embodiment of dependability, someone you could count on in times of need. Stories about him flowed naturally through the community. The time he helped an elderly neighbor clear snow from the driveway after a heavy Milwaukee snowfall, or when he organized a local fundraiser to repair the roof of the neighborhood hall. Every anecdote reinforced a vision of a man of goodwill, careful to maintain the image of normalcy and respectability. This reputation created a dangerous illusion. It masked decades of violence that had gone unnoticed, hiding a man whose past actions haunted the city silently. For Detective Petrova and her team, the emotional strain of reconciling this public persona with the decades-old crime was immense. How could a man so kind and seemingly harmless be responsible for a brutal act that had shattered a family and tormented a community for nearly 50 years? Neighbors' unawareness added tension to the operation. Every friendly wave, every casual conversation with community members, served as a stark reminder of the predator's ability to blend seamlessly into ordinary life. The detectives understood that the community's perception was about to collide violently with the truth. As the investigation closed in, the contrast between Orion Kincaid, the admired neighbor, and Orion Kincaid, the cold-blooded murderer, would create shockwaves that no one could ignore. As Detective Petrova's team monitored Orion Kincaid, every ordinary action took on a new, ominous weight. The quiet morning walks, the carefully tended garden, even his trips to the corner store, all became data points in a painstaking investigation. Officers tracked him discreetly, blending into the background as they documented his routines, observing what no neighbor ever suspected. Each movement was scrutinized for signs that could connect him to the decades-old murder. The tension among the team was palpable. Petrova knew the emotional burden of confirming suspicions against a man whose life seemed impeccable on the surface. Every step in the surveillance operation carried stakes far beyond standard protocol. There was no room for error. Years of hope and decades of grief rested on their ability to confirm the identity of Mary Schlais's killer without alerting him. While Orion continued his daily interactions, the detectives prepared for the next crucial phase, obtaining a sample of his DNA without raising alarm. The plan was precise, nothing reckless, nothing obvious. Every discarded coffee cup, every handled object, would be potential evidence. The pressure mounted as time ticked by, with the knowledge that one mistake could allow a murderer to maintain his hidden life and deny justice once again. This phase of the investigation tested the team's patience and nerves. They balanced the public's trust in a familiar neighbor with the imperative to confront decades-old evil. Every gesture Kincaid made a wave to a neighbor, a nod to a passerby, reminded the detectives of the duality they were about to expose. As the night approached and the operation moved forward, one truth became undeniable. The quiet streets, the smiles, and the community admiration were about to collide with an invisible shadow that had lingered for nearly 50 years. The revelation would be seismic. The final piece of the puzzle required an unprecedented step, obtaining Orion Kincaid's DNA without alerting him. Detectives Petrova and her team orchestrated the operation with careful precision, blending into the routines of everyday life. A single discarded coffee cup from his morning cafe run became the key to unlocking decades of unanswered questions. The mundane object, once overlooked, now held the power to expose a hidden past and deliver justice long delayed. Every detail mattered. Officers documented his habits, noting when he left the house, where he walked, and how he interacted with neighbors. The contrast between the harmless persona and the looming threat of his secret past created a unique psychological tension. To the outside world, Orion remained the amiable, dependable neighbor, but the detectives saw the gravity of what lay beneath those decades of ordinary appearances. The operation was conducted quietly, yet the weight of the moment was immense. Petrova's team understood that the smallest misstep could alert Kincaid and compromise decades of investigation. This wasn't just about catching a criminal, it was about vindicating a family, restoring faith in the system, and proving that time does not grant immunity to those who commit grave acts. Even as Orion went about his daily life, watering plants, chatting politely with neighbors, maintaining the illusion of respectability, the unseen truth was moving closer to revelation. The DNA collected would either confirm years of speculation or require the detectives to reassess everything. Every second heightened the tension, the city unaware that a long-buried crime was on the verge of coming to light. The moment of reckoning was near. The quiet suburb, the friendly interactions, and the everyday normalcy were about to be disrupted by the undeniable evidence of a crime hidden in plain sight. The shadow of justice was closing in, and nothing would remain the same. Once the DNA sample was secured, the tension in the cold case unit reached a near breaking point. Petrova and her team knew that this single piece of evidence could confirm everything or leave them questioning years of painstaking work. Every phone call, every lab update, carried the weight of decades of grief, fear, and uncertainty. The detectives waited in a mixture of anticipation and dread, fully aware that the truth could shock an entire community. Orion Kincaid continued his daily routine, completely unaware of the storm that had quietly descended around him. The neighbors, oblivious to the investigation unfolding in their midst, greeted him with smiles and nods, maintaining a sense of normalcy that now seemed fragile. Every ordinary interaction amplified the contrast between his public persona and the dark secret that had haunted Milwaukee for nearly 50 years. Inside the lab, technicians ran multiple controls to ensure accuracy. The results would be definitive, leaving no room for error. Every procedural step was executed with the utmost care, understanding that this evidence could finally give Mary Schlais's family the closure they had been denied for decades. The meticulous work of the cold case unit converged on this single moment. Confirmation of a long-sought truth. For Detective Petrova, the waiting was excruciating. She reflected on the generations of investigators who had tried and failed to bring justice, and on the patience of the Schlais family, whose lives had been defined by loss and unanswered questions. The impending results had the power to end decades of suffering, exposing Orion Kincaid as the man behind the crime. As hours passed and the lab worked silently, the detectives braced for impact. Soon, the quiet suburb, the smiles, and the seeming normality of Orion Kincaid's life would collide with the irrefutable proof that had remained hidden for decades. The truth was about to speak, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. The lab phone rang like a drum in Detective Petrova's ears. The moment had arrived. The results from the DNA analysis were in, and they left no room for doubt. Orion Kincaid's profile matched the biological evidence collected from the night Mary Schlais was murdered, 100%. Every hesitation, every unanswered question, and every decade of unresolved grief converged into a single, undeniable truth. Petrova felt a surge of emotions, a mix of validation, relief, and the weight of sorrow for the family who had waited nearly half a century for this moment. The silent whispers of evidence from 1974 had finally spoken with brutal clarity. Her hands trembled as she documented the result, fully aware that this confirmation would set into motion a chain of events that would shake the community to its core. In that instant, the reality hit. Decades of careful living, a public image of kindness, and years of seeming innocence could no longer shield Orion Kincaid. The meticulous, quiet man next door was now exposed as a perpetrator of an unforgivable crime. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on everyone in the room. Petrova knew there was no turning back. The confirmation was not just a procedural victory, it was the opening salvo in a confrontation that would bring decades of tension to a climactic point. Every officer involved braced for what was to come, understanding that the arrest would be intense, emotional, and historic. If this case shook you, subscribe before the next twist. The next step was clear. Orion Kincaid would face the consequences, and the city of Milwaukee would finally confront the truth it had avoided for nearly 50 years. The morning air hung heavy over the quiet suburban street as Detective Petrova and her team approached Orion Kincaid's home. The neighborhood remained unsuspecting, children playing, neighbors greeting one another, unaware that decades of hidden horror were about to surface. Kincaid opened the door in a knitted sweater, holding a mug of coffee, his calm demeanor masking nothing but the ordinary routines of a life lived in quiet secrecy. Petrova read the charges aloud. First-degree homicide of Mary Schlais, November 1st, 1974. The words seemed to hang in the air, stretching the moments into eternity. Orion's eyes, usually warm and familiar to those around him, went blank. For a fleeting second, the mask of the friendly neighbor slipped, revealing the shadow that had been carried silently for decades. The officers moved with controlled precision, but the tension was palpable. Every step, every exchange, resonated with the weight of years spent waiting for justice. For the Schlais family, the arrest was a long-delayed reckoning, a mixture of relief, grief, and the haunting memories of a life stolen. The community would soon learn that the man they had trusted, the neighbor who baked cookies and volunteered, was the same man who had ended the life of a young college student almost 50 years earlier. The moment captured the paradox of evil hidden in plain sight. A life, outwardly ordinary, masking a past no one could have imagined. The arrest marked the culmination of decades of patient investigation, persistence, and hope. The quiet suburb was now the stage for justice, and the long shadow of fear and uncertainty was finally beginning to lift. Once inside the interrogation room, Orion Kincaid sat quietly, his calm facade gradually eroding under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Detective Petrova entered, DNA results in hand, a quiet authority radiating from her. The air was thick with decades of unresolved pain, the echoes of Mary Schlais's life and death pressing on every surface. At first, Kincaid attempted denial, his voice steady but brittle. He spoke of mistakes, coincidences, and misidentifications. But each phrase was met with the cold, objective reality of the DNA match. Slowly, the weight of truth began to crack his composure. Petrova observed closely, noting the subtle signs of a mind grappling with exposure after 50 years of secrecy. Minutes stretched like hours. The once controlled man became increasingly unsettled, his words faltering, his hands fidgeting. The confrontation was surgical evidence, timelines, and the narrative of that night dismantled his defenses piece by piece. The psychological strain was undeniable. The tension of 50 years, compressed into a single moment of reckoning. Then, the walls Orion had built around his dark secret collapsed entirely. Confession spilled forth, hesitant at first, then unrestrained. He admitted to the attack on Mary Schlais, confirming the intentional discarding of her purse and the size 10 footprint. The evidence Petrova held now had a voice, amplified by the gravity of admission. This confession wasn't just an end for the detectives. It was a moment of closure for the city, for a family who had waited nearly 5 decades for answers, and for the silent witness of justice itself. The balance between horror and relief shifted as the truth finally emerged in full clarity. News of Orion Kincaid's arrest and confession spread through Milwaukee like wildfire. The quiet suburb, once a symbol of safety, now became a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary of masks. Neighbors who had waved at Kincaid for decades grappled with disbelief. How could the same hands that mended fences, tended gardens, and baked for community events have committed an act so horrific nearly 50 years ago? For the Schlais family, the emotional release was almost unbearable. Dorian and Vivian, now elderly, had carried grief in every waking moment since 1974. When Petrova personally conveyed the confession, tears streamed freely, mingled with relief, exhaustion, and the bitter realization of time lost. "It's over," whispered Dorian, the weight of decades finally lifting, though the scars of trauma would linger forever. The city itself reacted with a mixture of horror and fascination. Media outlets, blogs, and social platforms dissected every detail, replaying the chilling contrast between Kincaid's gentle public persona and the monstrous act he had hidden for decades. Citizens debated, mourned, and confronted the uncomfortable truth. Evil often wears the face of the familiar. For law enforcement and the cold case unit, the success was a vindication of persistence, technology, and human dedication. The DNA breakthrough, the genealogy mapping, and the meticulous investigation culminated in a moment that exemplified the triumph of justice over time. If this case shook you, subscribe before the next twist. The city's collective psyche shifted, forever altered by the realization that the past can reach into the present and that justice, though delayed, can still arrive. As Orion Kincaid was led away, cameras capturing the final act of accountability, the story didn't just end, it transformed. Decades of uncertainty, fear, and grief gave way to a collective sigh of justice finally served. The city, the family, and the detectives who had never wavered could now begin to reckon with the truth. This moment also serves as a reminder. Unresolved crimes may linger in shadows, but persistence and truth have power. If you followed this story to the very edge of revelation, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to stay safe. And if you haven't subscribed, tell us why. In the comments. The courtroom was tense, the air heavy with decades of anticipation. Reporters crowded the back rows, cameras poised, capturing every subtle shift in expression. At the center of it all sat Orion Kincaid, the quiet retired postal worker whose friendly demeanor had long masked the monstrous act of November 1st, 1974. Today, that mask could no longer shield him. The prosecution laid out the evidence meticulously, recounting the cold night Mimi Schlais disappeared, the preserved biological sample, and the breakthrough DNA that finally traced the crime to Kincaid. Each piece of evidence was a hammer striking the past, reverberating across nearly half a century. Witnesses were called, former neighbors, forensic specialists, and even those who had worked with Kincaid decades earlier, all painting a picture of the man they thought they knew, now fractured by the horrific truth. The defense had little room to maneuver. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, the confession unwavering. Kincaid entered his plea. Guilty, acknowledging his actions after all those years. The courtroom was momentarily silent, the weight of 49 years of unanswered questions pressing down on everyone present. For Dorian and Vivian Schlais, every second was an emotional storm. Relief intertwined with grief, decades of pain surfacing in waves that neither comfort nor time had been able to soothe until now. The community watched, holding its collective breath, as the legal machinery finally aligned with the long-awaited justice. If decades of waiting for justice matters to you, subscribe now, don't let another story slip by. The trial had begun. But this was just the start of a day where history, morality, and law converged. The closure of decades of pain would soon be more than a courtroom formality. It would be a reckoning for a city, a family, and a long-silenced victim. The moment the judge's voice cut through the courtroom, declaring Orion Kincaid guilty, decades of tension finally snapped. It was a simple, yet seismic pronouncement. Guilty of second-degree murder for the death of Mary Mimi Schlais. Time seemed to collapse. The past 49 years rushed back in memories, pain, and unanswered questions now met with the stark reality of accountability. Kincaid remained composed at first, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. The weight of his actions at last fully sinking in, the sentence was pronounced: life imprisonment. A guarantee that the man who had hidden in plain sight could no longer harm anyone again. For the Schlais family, the verdict was not a joyous celebration but a profound relief, an acknowledgement that the system, even after nearly half a century, had aligned with the truth. Lawyers on both sides exchanged formal nods, but the undercurrent in the room was raw emotion. Detectives and staff who had labored over the cold case felt the release of years of frustration, seeing their work and faith in science vindicated. The courtroom buzzed quietly, whispers of astonishment and reflection spreading from one witness to the next. The media captured every reaction. The tentative tears of those who had long feared justice might never come. Kincaid's attempts at maintaining dignity crumbled as cameras flashed, his life now defined by the horror he had committed. If waiting decades for justice affects you, subscribe now. Don't let other victims remain silent. The conviction was more than legal closure, it was a symbolic reckoning, a final statement that truth, no matter how long buried, could not be erased. With the gavel's strike, the city, the family, and the investigators could finally begin to breathe, though the scars of the past would always linger. Outside the courthouse, Dorian and Vivian Schlais stood together, fragile yet resolute, their hands trembling as they clutched one another. For nearly 5 decades, they had carried the unbearable weight of Mimi's absence, a void filled with questions, sleepless nights, and silent mourning. Now, at last, a small measure of peace entered their lives. Vivian's lips quivered as tears ran freely, a release decades overdue. "It's over," Dorian whispered, his voice barely audible over the hushed crowd. "Mimi can finally rest." Across Milwaukee, the community absorbed the shock of Kincaid's true identity and the delayed justice. Neighbors recalled the quiet man with his neat lawn, courteous greetings, and volunteer efforts, none of which could erase the horror he had concealed for so long. Conversations buzzed with disbelief. How had evil remained hidden for so many years? Walking among them, as if nothing had ever occurred. Local business owners, former classmates, and friends of the Schlais family gathered, each sharing stories of Mimi, her laughter, her ambitions, and the gaping loss left in her wake. Emotions were raw sorrow mingling with vindication. Some quietly wept, others stood in stoic silence, collectively bearing witness to the closure of a wound that had once seemed permanent. If decades of grief moved you, subscribe, don't allow other truths to stay buried. The city, though relieved, remained reflective. Fear and uncertainty had faded slightly, replaced by a sober understanding. Evil could hide in ordinary places, but the persistence of justice, even when delayed, was unstoppable. The Schlais family, now supported by the community's shared grief and empathy, began the slow process of healing, a process made possible only because someone refused to let the case rest quietly in the shadows of the past. As the dust settled on the trial, Milwaukee collectively grappled with the unsettling truth. Orion Kincaid had lived a lifetime of outward respectability while harboring a violent past. The quiet streets, once tinged with fear of the unknown, now carried a somber awareness. Evil could wear the face of normalcy, blend seamlessly into neighborhoods, and evade detection for decades. Conversations in local cafes, homes, and community centers revolved around one question: how well do we really know the people around us? The case had shattered assumptions, forcing residents to reconcile decades of trust with the reality of hidden malevolence. It was a bitter reminder that appearances were fragile shields, and even the most ordinary life could conceal darkness. The investigators reflected on the journey from the cold 1974 crime scene to the breakthrough DNA match nearly half a century later. Each step highlighted the evolution of justice, persistence, patience, and the tireless application of science and intuition. Detective Lena Petrova, whose determination had reignited hope, became a symbol of resolve, demonstrating that time could not weaken commitment to truth. If you value the unseen fight for justice, subscribe now, don't ignore what could happen next. For the Schlais family, this reflection was bittersweet. They had obtained closure, yet the decades of grief and uncertainty could never fully be undone. The memory of Mimi, preserved in photographs and shared stories, remained a guiding force, a reminder of both loss and the eventual triumph of accountability. As Milwaukee looked forward, the case became more than a solved mystery. It was a lesson etched into the city's collective consciousness. Vigilance matters. Time cannot protect wrongdoing, and justice, no matter how delayed, will always leave a mark. The courtroom emptied, but the weight of history lingered. The resolution of Mimi's case wasn't just a personal victory for the Schlais family, It was a testament to truth prevailing against decades of silence and concealment. Across Milwaukee, conversations shifted from shock to reflection. People considered the fragile line between ordinary life and hidden danger, realizing that vigilance and justice often travel hand in hand, even decades apart. The final message resounded: truth outlives time. Evil always leaves a trace. It was more than a phrase. It was a reminder that accountability can arrive, no matter how long the wait. This case illustrated the importance of perseverance, of refusing to allow unanswered questions to linger indefinitely, and the power of modern science when coupled with unwavering dedication. Subscribe to stay safe. Don't let hidden truths pass you by. Even as the emotional closure settled, a subtle challenge remained for viewers. This was an invitation to engage, to participate, to acknowledge the value of vigilance. Those who had not subscribed were encouraged to confront their hesitation. And if you haven't subscribed, tell us why in the comments. Don't stay silent. The Schlais family, though forever marked by loss, could now begin to rebuild their lives with a measure of peace. The city, shaken yet wiser, absorbed the lessons of hidden evil, community resilience, and the unstoppable pursuit of justice. In the end, the resolution of a 9-year-old cold case became more than a headline. It became a reminder that no truth can remain buried indefinitely, and no voice advocating for justice can ever be fully silenced.